1 Samuel chapter 28, if you have your Bibles, let's turn over there. We're finishing up our study of Samuel, who was both judge and prophet today. And really we're ending up with in one sense, is a simple, basic discussion, but as we go through the text, you're going to probably have some questions. And we're going to really probably have to push to get through it. But as we begin, it's been said about sin, and it certainly is true, that sin will take you farther than you want to go, sin will leave you longer than you want to stay, and sin will cost you far more than you want to pay. And perhaps no single individual in the Bible exemplifies the truthfulness of this principle than King Saul. As we've studied his life, we looked at the beginning of his reign and how it began with such promise. What enabled King Saul's reign to begin with such promise? What was the disposition that he possessed which allowed him to have such a promising beginning? He was humble, exactly right, Sister Ruby. He was a man of great humility, and if you recall on the day that he was presented to Israel, he was not among the number. In fact, the text tells us there in 1 Samuel 11 that he was hidden among the stuff. He was modest. He had a sense of humility, of humbleness. However, did that last? Well, sadly, no, as we've looked in 1 Samuel 13 and 15, that humility didn't last. He disobeyed God. And so we might say that after his initial disobedience, it was all downhill for Saul from there. The rest of his life and reign as king over Israel, we might sum it up with the phrase self-destruction. And that's what sin does to a person, is it not? Does not sin cause a person to self-destruct when they choose to rebel against God and to live a life separate and apart from God? Saul's destruction, his spiritual above all, but even his physical, as we're going to note today, was due to self, personal choices that he made, personal attitudes he manifested. And as we noted, it began with a self-deception that he had obeyed God completely when in reality he had disobeyed him. Remember the event in 1 Samuel 15 we studied a couple of weeks ago when he spared the King Agag and the best of the flocks? What did he tell Saul? What did he tell Samuel when Samuel arrived on the scene? Indeed, that's exactly right, Sister Ruby. Saul, and we're not sure on his basic disposition here, perhaps he was just so full of himself that he failed to see that he hadn't obeyed God fully, but he tried to claim that he had obeyed God fully, when in reality he had disobeyed. And certainly it continued with his allowing himself to be influenced by Satan and to further develop an attitude of rebellion against God, and which led to the mindset that doing things God's way was no longer important to him. And we see this, and we didn't study this in this quarter, but 1 Samuel 16, 14 and following would detail this. And this ultimately led Saul to becoming so jealous of David, so envious, that he would do all he could to have David murdered. And you can study chapters 19 and following to see the events that relate to David and Saul, how Saul wanted David murdered. And today, in our study of 1 Samuel 28, we're going to find that it led him to dabbling in the occult to try to find appeasement for his troubles. And ultimately, we're going to see that it leads him to taking his own life, as we're going to briefly note from chapter 31. Sin indeed is alluring. Sin appears to be pleasurable. Sin indeed appears to bring people what they want. But what does sin actually do to a person, as we've noted? Or what does sin actually do?
It
Weakens them.
Kills.
It's deceiving, isn't it?
Grows.
It grows. And Satan doesn't want men to see the end result of sin, does he? He wants men to believe that a life separate and apart from God will get them what they need and where they want to go. And again, he does not want men to see that sin is nothing more than a dead-end road. In Matthew 7, verse 13. And Saul sadly chose this dead-end road. And we're going to note where it led him. And certainly a study of Saul's actions here in 1 Samuel 28 should convince everyone that it doesn't pay to live a life of sin. It doesn't pay to defy God and His will, because all it results in is traveling down a dead-end road, which leads to a hopeless end. And that's what I want us to focus in on this morning. As we look at the events of 1 Samuel 28, really in all of this, we're going to see the consequences of sin, how desperate it makes men. And we're going to look at it from the perspective of Samuel being summoned from the dead. And we're going to look how far sin will take a person. And we're going to look in our study this morning at the desperation on the part of Saul, which produced an act of deception on his part, which led to the encounter with Samuel, who was roused from death, his sleep in death. And of course, we're going to note the final prophecies of Samuel pronouncing the defeat of Israel, which would spell Saul's destruction. And again, we're going to see in all of this just how dangerous, just how deadly sin is, and how far it can take us if we choose to do so. And again, it doesn't matter how old we are. It doesn't matter how young we are. When we are accountable to God, we need to understand just how devastating sin is. And I have friends that I grew up with. We obeyed the gospel together when we were younger. And I've seen from his life just how far sin will take a person. A close childhood friend who made some bad choices after becoming a Christian. And ultimately, the last time I heard, he was in jail because he'd robbed a store. And yet we grew up in the church together. And certainly we want to see this principle from the standpoint of what it did to Saul. And so as we consider the lesson this morning, let's look at chapter 28, and let's begin. We're going to begin in verses 3 and following. Certainly we don't have the time to look at the full overall historical context, but you would note by this time Samuel had died. Verse 3 notes this, and really it also is noted he died back in chapter 25. But this is to remind us of that Samuel had passed on. The spiritual leader of Israel was dead, And so the nation was obviously in a time of mourning. Politically, the nation was in a time of turmoil with Saul's deteriorating reign and his clashes with David. And some would suggest you could question Saul's sanity by this point, but I don't know how reasonable an explanation that would be. However, we do know at this juncture, according to the first couple of verses of chapter 28, David had made alliances with the Philistines. And again, you go back and study the preceding chapters, and you will note how this came about. Fortunately, though, David did not set himself up against his own people, because Achish, king of the Philistines, who initially desired him to go to battle with them, ultimately sent him home because certain princes of the Philistines were distrustful of him. And again, this is noted in chapter 29. However, as we begin our study, we're going to note that Saul's plight or his desperation is seen in 3 different statements in this section. Number 1, Samuel's death. He could no longer seek counsel from the prophet. And really, after what we saw in our study of chapter 15, when Samuel departed from him, we don't know if he would have even provided Saul with counsel. But Saul could no longer go to Samuel. Number 2, he removed the mediums and the spiritists, as the King James Version puts it, witches, wizards from the land, but in reality they were spiritists. However, we're also going to see an act of deception. Number 3, his resorting to secrecy. And again, we're going to notice hypocrisy. The same man who drove these people out of the land, now he's going to ultimately run to them. and trying to contact the dead. And again, the reason he would do this would be God refusing to hear his prayer, as we're going to note here in just a moment. But as we look at these three statements, notice verse number 3. And if someone would read the phrase where it begins with "and Saul." If someone would read this last phrase of verse number 3 for us.
So it put away those familiar spirits and places of the widows out of the land.
We could probably spend the next hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours just discussing this phrase here. There's a lot people have asked about this verse, a lot of questions you might have. But as you consider this purging, this was not a new practice. In fact, the practice of attempting to make contact with the spirit world was a prevalent practice in ancient cultures in the Near East. Now the question is, do we still see this today? We do. The form of so-called mediums in their so-called seances. It's not real, is it? A lot of smoke, glass, and mirrors. And the practice of such spiritism, witchcraft, mediums, astrology, these occultic practices, was forbidden under the Mosaical law in the strongest of terms. And some passages you would consider are Deuteronomy 18, verses 9 through 13, Leviticus 19:31, as well as chapter 20, verses 6 and 27, as well as Isaiah chapter 8, verses 19 and 20. And the practice of such, this practice is still condemned under the New Testament times. When you look at the works of the flesh in Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 through 21, what is listed amongst the works of the flesh there? Begins with a W.
Witchcraft.
Very good, Rusty. In witchcraft. And it's interesting to note that word there deals with principles, things that sort of bring poison the mind. And so that has an application to occultic practices as well as to illicit drugs. And really, you look at the Greek word there, it's from which we get what we might consider our word pharmacy today, pharmakeia. And I may not have pronounced that properly, but it's from a similar word. Now, why was this condemned? Why would God so strongly condemn such a practice? Why would God forbid his people from engaging in this? Let's consider this question.
There's one God, he's holy, and he wanted their complete attention, devotion, and faith.
Exactly right, Sister Nina. The purpose was that it was considered by God to be a substitution of other counsel in the place of that provided by God himself.
Well, when they were directed, if they had any power, it came from the devil, it didn't come from God.
Yeah. Certainly wouldn't be from God, even if they had the power. But they didn't. But I think it's interesting to note. Don't you find it interesting, though, here in this verse that Saul initially drove these people out? Now, why would Saul drive them out? Why would Saul go to this much trouble to drive them out? Why do you think the purpose was for him trying to drive them out?
Keep them away from the people.
Keep them away from the people. That's a good explanation, Rusty. And would you not think that would make his actions in the following verses that much more hypocritical? Indeed, because he's going to drive them out, but then he's going to run to them himself.
Well, he was probably afraid that they would make predictions against him. He didn't want the people to live.
That's another good explanation, Dusty. Some have also suggested that he wanted to do it to make it appear, to give the pretense as if he was still interested in doing God's will, that he attempted to fulfill his responsibilities as king. In other words, this explanation suggests that he was doing this as a dog and pony show to try to please God. when God had already rejected him.
Well,
So,
Saul was a jealous person all the way through, and he didn't want anything or anybody that would question his power. Look at how he turned against David.
yeah, he did everything, and he did anything and everything to try to have David put to death. He was a very envious man. And really, don't you think his problems with David started with after the events with Goliath?
Well, now, wanted the people that cried, Saul has conquered his
Thousands.
but David is
10,000.
10,000. See, jealousy right there. He couldn't take it.
He was jealous and envy. And jealousy, when we think about jealousy, it's a dangerous sin for us today, is it not too? What can jealousy do to us if we're not careful? Destroy you.
It's a sign of insecurity. Jealousy is a sign of insecurity. There's a lot of areas of brain study.
And jealousy has been described as the green-eyed monster. I would suggest envy is its close kin. But we see what jealousy did to the life of Saul. And certainly that can show to us just the need to make sure we're not jealous. And look at verse number 4. With all of this going on, the Philistines gathered themselves together, and they were going to come to the war. The moment was right, they saw, for them to attack. Samuel was dead. The nation was mourning. David, it appeared, was on their side. Saul was losing his grip on his rule, and so to them, if any time they were going to get at Israel, now was the time. And it's noted that the plan was for the Philistine armies to march along the north along the coastal plain to the valley of Jezreel. And we've talked about that on Wednesday night in our study of Hosea. And then knife eastward across that valley. In this region, Saul's defenses were thin, and the flat terrain gave the Philistine military superiority because of their chariots. And so they thought if they could just go this way, if they took seeing this, they thought they could take advantage of this. And so, what was Saul's reaction to all of this?
His heart greatly trembled. Verse 5.
Yeah, he was fearful. He was fearful in verse number 5, and you're going to note here, our book notes on page 139 that as he retreated before the Philistines, it's now here that King Saul sought divine guidance. Now, what was he hoping for from this here in verse number 6? He was hoping God was going to tell him he was going to win. But what was God's response to Saul? He didn't even answer him. And again, notice he went through the proper channels. And again, notice the phrase, God did not answer him by dreams, nor by the prophets. Obviously, Samuel was dead. Nor by the Urim. And again, the book notes that the Urim and the Thummim means by which God spoke during times of crisis, Exodus 28:30. And the high priest wore a breastplate containing this. And
The sun's glow. I've never understood that. When they answer, did these Urim and whatever these two stones were, did they change colors, or how did he communicate through them?
That's a good question.
Blessed is in the heart, except I just finished reading part of that. And that, I got stumped when it came to that part. Well, what are these things?
Well, it was on the high priest.
It was on the high priest.
And he told him how to make his vegetables.
If I had more time, I need to study that so I can give a better answer. But obviously it was the way by which God communicated. And obviously here, he refused to answer Saul through these means, did he not? I think that's the important point to consider here as well, that he refused to answer Saul. And It is noted, if you look at the account in 1 Chronicles 10, verse 14, it says that Saul did not inquire of the Lord. But there is no contradiction, because Saul did not inquire at the right time, in the right way, and with the right attitude. And again, as we've discussed, Saul could have repented and submitted himself to God's will long before these events. Thus, it's really no surprise to us that God didn't answer him. And
God had transferred the power, when he anointed David.
yeah,
He
But-
how the Spirit of the Lord went into
Right.
David and left Saul.
but even then, I think it's important to note, though, that David didn't attempt to usurp the throne from Saul at that time. Remember, David still considered Saul king until the time of his death.
Out of respect for the Lord.
Indeed. Yeah, and that's a great point. Whereas Saul was envious and jealous, David
And respect for the throne of God's chosen one.
And even though, and there was an occasion when David could have killed Saul, but he refused to do so because he was the king. In Proverbs 28, verse 9, it says about this, "He that turneth away his ear from hearing the law, that is, the word of God, even his prayer shall be abomination." That describes the prayer of Saul. That describes Saul's actions here in God's sight, does it not, as nothing more than abomination? So God refused to hear Saul, so what does Saul do now?
He went to the witches.
He wanted one of these familiar spirits, these witches or wizards that they had driven out of the land. And he asked his servant in verse number 7. And again, I find it ironic, do we not, that these same individuals he had driven out were now needed by him in his time of desperation. But why wouldn't he repent? As we consider this point, what kept Saul from repenting?
His own pride.
His own pride. And why do you think? Why do you think he was? Why do you think he let pride get in the way?
Sin.
Well, yeah, sin does that.
His head was too big. He didn't want to.
Got a big head, didn't
He
he?
didn't want to humble himself before God.
Exact. That's a good point, Rusty. Got the big head and then refused. Then he began to think that he was bigger than God, that he could do things his own way. And again, we see what pride and stubbornness leads to, attempting anything and everything that could help him in his situation with the Philistines. And so he was told there was a woman at Endor that could help him. Now, some have said that what happens next didn't actually occur. But it actually occurred, through whose power did it occur? It was through God's power. And
Well, this author in this book said the image that she pulled up was Samuel's, but the voice was God's. Well, so what's new? Samuel always spoke for God.
yeah, he
And
spoke for.
I think that the voice came from Samuel, but it was under God's direction.
That is an excellent point, Sister Ruby. It was Samuel speaking by God's direction, because the text is going to tell us that Samuel said. Wouldn't that not indicate that it was Samuel's voice? And we're going to get to that here in just a moment. Notice here his deception. In verse number 8, what does Saul do prior to going to see this woman? Oh, he disguised himself. Would we not say he was practicing duplicity here and trying to conceal his true identity? Why would Saul try to hide his identity here?
Because why would the king of Israel need to go to a witch to get his problem solved?
There you go, Rusty.
He'd already run them all out.
He'd already run them all out, too.
Went to kill
Does this not make Saul a hypocrite? Big time. Exactly right, Dusty. He didn't want his hypocrisy exposed now, did he? The same man who drove them out, as y'all pointed out, is the same man now coming now for help in this time of crisis. And so he comes and he makes a request, bring him up whom I shall name. Now what was her concern about all of this? Verse number 9. She thought, if Saul hears about this, he's gonna kill me. Now, little did she know who it was that was speaking to her at this juncture, now did she? Now, what did Saul tell her when she said that she was concerned for her life? There shall be no punishment happen to thee for this thing. You're going to be all right. And so, we have the question by the woman, verse 11. Whom shall I bring up unto thee? And so, what did Saul respond? Samuel. Bring me up Samuel. Now, notice verse number 12. Here is where Saul is exposed. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice. And again, this would indicate that she didn't do this herself, correct? This indicates that this didn't happen by her own power. The text says she saw it, does not say anything about her doing anything. And rather it was God who raised Samuel. And so, who was the most surprised person in the room, according to the book, to see this? She was.
So it was something today, they'll tell you they knew all these things, but the king, and this happened, and it surprised her.
It surprised her. Do you really think she was expecting anything to happen? No. And when it happened, so she cried out. She was afraid. And she cried with the idea of this crying with a loud voice indicates her fear. And what did she come to realize after seeing Samuel come up? What's that?
Saul was.
But this wasn't just any man, this was Saul. And so what did she tell Saul here?
I saw God's ascending on the earth.
No, verse 12. Why have you deceived me, Saul? And so he's been exposed here. And
She was afraid of him because he'd run him out of town.
indeed, and yet in her mind, the same one who had run her and her kind out of the land is the same one who made her do this action. And so now she's not only fearful, but don't you think she's a bit angry at Saul? Don't you think she's a wee bit angry at Saul too? In her fear?
She's really afraid.
Yeah, verse 13. However, Saul tells her not to be afraid. But, and she says, tell me what you saw. And she does. And then in verse number 14, she didn't know it was Samuel. She didn't know, but did Saul? He knew immediately based on her description that he was covered with a mantle. And again, the prophetic mantle indicated that it was a prophet. And so Saul, again, trying to show his reverence. What does he do when he affirms that it is Samuel? What was his reaction to seeing Samuel? Bowed before him.
What's that up there when it says she saw whether the gods ascended down to the earth?
Spirits, I would say. That's another good question.
Other people,
That could be. That could be. Some of these idols or some of these creators of these idols, I don't have a good answer right now. I can get the answer. But needless to say, she did see the power of God here. And so, as we think about Saul's reaction, why do you think he bowed before Samuel?
still realize the power Samuel had with God.
Indeed. What do you think he was hoping to hear?
It'll be all right.
It'll be all right. You don't have to worry, Saul. It's going to be all right. That's what he was hoping to hear. Now notice the remainder of this section, verses 15 through 25. Samuel asks the question, "Why hast thou disquieted me to bring me up?" And of course, Saul answers about his distress and his plight regarding the Philistines. And so he asks Samuel, "Well, what shall I do?" Now, what was Samuel's reply? What was Samuel's reply in verses 16 and following? What did he pronounce upon Saul?
God's curse. He said,
pronounced, curse, doom.
God had become his enemy.
Yeah, verse 16. Samuel's, again, Samuel's reminded him, is he not? Why are you asking me this? You know what happened. You know God has rejected you. The Lord has rent the kingdom out of thy hand. But notice verse number 19 and bringing this to a close. What does Samuel tell Saul here? What was going to happen to him on the morrow? You're going to die tomorrow at the hands of the Philistines. You're going to be delivered, and the armies of Israel are going to be defeated, and you and your offspring, you're going to die. Now, how did Saul react to this? Verse number 20. What's that, Rusty? I like your response.
Kills itself.
Well, yeah, in chapter 31, but here he's in despair, is he not? And his meeting with Samuel had done him what? Had it done any good for him? Done him no good. And he found out that, as our book puts it, the reckoning day had come. He and his sons would join Samuel in the grave within the next 24 hours. Hence, we come to chapter 31 and we see Samuel's death. We see his destruction here. In verse number 1, we see the Philistines fighting against Israel and the men of Israel fleeing from before the Philistines. And they fell down slain in Gilboa. And of course, the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and his sons. And what happened at this juncture? What did the Philistines do? Well, they killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Melchishua, who were the sons of Saul. In verse 3, we see the key verse here. The battle went sore against Saul. So in other words, how was going the fight against the armies of Philistine for Israel and Saul?
Philistines were kicking their butts.
It was futile. It wasn't going well at all. And he was wounded. The archers hit him, and he was sore wounded by the archers. And so Saul tells his armor bearer, and he tells his armor bearer to draw my sword and do what? Kill him. This is how far sin will take a person, is it not? This is really the ultimate end, is it not? Did it have to be this way? How bad does it have to be for a person to tell another person, kill me?
It was prideful because he didn't want them
Indeed.
to take his body because
Yeah.
he didn't want it to be on public display or whatever.
Exactly, Dusty. Again, as you pointed out here in verse 4, this was pride again. He didn't want the Philistines to come and thrust him through and abuse him.
Well, Samuel had told Saul all this before he died.
Yeah.
And then the message that he had for Saul when he had him called up from the dead was the same thing. He said, I told you, God's going to take the kingdom away from you and give it to David.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
The difference, though, with this raising was he told them then exactly when it was going to occur. It was going to occur tomorrow, which we're seeing here. So how did the armor bearer react here?
Can't do that.
Can't do that. I'm not going to do it. And so, since the armor bearer didn't do it, what did Saul do? Fell on his own sword, took his own life. And again, as Dusty pointed out, his pride led to his downfall.
They still cut his head off.
What's that?
They still cut his head off and dig it with him.
Indeed, yeah. There's no way he was going to stop that, as they took it with him as a sign of victory, sign of conquering at their enemies. This reminds us that indeed, pride goeth before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall, does it not? And that's what led to Saul's destruction here, is it not? Pride? An unwillingness to do as God said? And that's what makes his life so tragic, is it not? He started out, as we've observed earlier and as we've observed in prior lessons, he had a promising beginning, but how did his life end? Miserable failure. So it isn't how we start, is it, but how we end. I mean, you look at the New Testament. You look at Saul of Tarsus. If you didn't study anything other than Acts 8 and Acts chapter 8, how would you think his life would end? Like Saul's here. However, how did Saul of Tarsus' life end? Obviously, he had a bad start in the sight of God.
Jesus,
He had a good end, didn't he? When he obeyed the gospel, he turned his life around. And his focus in life changed. So so it isn't how we start in this life. We can have a good start but make a bad finish, but also we can make a bad start but have a good finish. I'd rather personally have a good start and good finish. But it isn't the start that counts, it's the finish. And as we pointed out before, the tortoise and the hare, how'd that rabbit start in that race? On fire. How'd he finish? Dead last. Tortoise started out slow, but how'd he finish? First place. He won. And so that's the principle here. The sad series of events comes to a close with a sad end. If Saul had simply not been lifted up with pride and acknowledged to God his sins and repented when he had the opportunity, would this have ever happened? Wouldn't have happened.
But this too tells something about David. That Jonathan was killed too. He was from Saul. But David loved Jonathan.
Mm-hmm.
And even in spite of what his father was trying to do
Indeed.
to him. And
Indeed.
so that speaks well of
They were
David's
best friends. In fact, Jonathan did his part to hide David from Saul, if you go back and look at previous chapters. That angered Saul himself. But certainly, we see that our choices in this life have consequences. And we've noted in our study the choices that Saul made were not good ones. So let us be reminded of the need to make the right choices in this life, unlike Saul, to choose to serve the Lord and to choose to do his will all the days of our life. To not just be a hearer of his word, but to be a doer of it. Unlike Saul, who heard God's word, but what did he not do? He didn't obey God's word. So let's not make the same mistakes.